When I did part 1 of this video on blocks and pistons, and specifically for this 300 TDI, I realised that there's a lot of people who watch this channel who are interested in series trucks, and I sort of neglected them a little bit because they had their own problems with blocks and pistons in the old series, the old 2 1/4s, and even going back to series 1s, they were special, shall we say. And the reason for that was, and this is relevant for all sort of British cars up until about the 1980s and 1990s, things started to change a little bit. But the metal quality for the blocks when they came out with the 300 TDIs changed dramatically. If a lot of you older guys out there can remember, and I'm talking to Rob now, that with the old 2 1/4 blocks and a lot of old blocks that were made in England, the pistons, when they were coming up and down the bore, would make a wear out the bore, but only as far as the top ring. Now let me explain that. When the piston's coming up the bore, the ring would only come so far, like, what's that, about 10 millimeters off the top of the face of the block. So what you used to end up with, because the blocks were very soft, you used to end up with a ridge around the top of the cylinder. Now if you noticed on the first video, I just popped these pistons out and they dropped out at the bottom with no problems at all. But if you've got a ridge in here, that's not going to happen. You're not going to be able to get the piston out, and you can't get it out the bottom. In North America there exists, and I'm not sure about the UK, but there was a tool that you could put in to the bore and take that ridge out so you could get your piston out. That's how bad it was. Now we know that when we were in the 70s, starting to drive and things like this, 70s and early 80s, we used to know that minis, the old minis there, as soon as they got to about 60,000 miles, they would start burning oil. And the reason for that was because the cylinders were getting bigger and bigger, the gaps in the rings, instead of being nice and tight, were starting to open out, and oil was passing through and they'd start to burn oil. I seem to be having problems with my camera. There's something wrong with the battery. It keeps cutting out, so bear with me. I'm going to have to edit this together. But I was going to say that there's about 2 or 3 times in my experience with 300 TDIs where I've had to have the blocks bored. They've been great. There've been no problems at all. And the reason why I've had to bore them out is because they've run out of water, or the radiators have been blocked up, they've got too hot, and the pistons have seized. Not seized, but they've started to get so hot they're starting to rub up and down the cylinders, and there's no lubrication, and they start to score the blocks, and that's the only reason why I've had to rebore them. So let's go back to the old days a little bit and piston rings, because in the old days, and this is how bad it was, we had to sometimes file the rings to make them a nice snug fit in the bore. Now I'm going to change the camera angle in a minute and show you what I'm talking about. But you used to have to, you used to get ring files and you used to file them down a bit so that the bore, the gap was correct. And the reason for that was, when you have a piston ring sat in a piston at the moment and it's cold, you will have a little gap. But as it warms up, this gap will get close and tight. It'll expand and get close. Okay, so that's really important. Now today we don't even seem to worry about that. They're all pre-gapped and we have no worries. But it was one of the things that we used to have to do. Now another thing about piston rings that you've got to be aware of, and this is why it's not really sort of a good idea to use the old ones again, is because you can't see it on here, but there used to be a slight angle on the ring, and they used to be marked top on top of the ring. Now, used one, been pounding up and down in the piston all the time, you can't see where it's etched on here, where it's top. I'm having a little bit of trouble with the video card in this camera. I've got a new one coming, but I wanted to put this piece into this video because I was trying to explain something about piston rings and why it's important for the direction and things like this and what they actually do. Basically on a TD, this is a sort of rough idea of what a piston looks like. You get no fancy graphics on this channel. But the TDI, if you cut the 300 TDI ring, cross section of it, you'll find the top ring is on a taper like this. Second ring, square. Now the bottom ring's it's very, very thin, and it's got an oil passage through the side here. And this bit represents a spring, so it's springing out. That's why I'm saying you've got to be very careful with these because they're so thin. And you'll find there's an oil way in here, so the oil coming up here can get round and back into the oil pan without going and being up to the side of the piston and being pumped. So that's it now. So that's pretty much straightforward. Things to watch out for. The top ring is reinforced with steel, so that's not really a bit of a problem. The second ring, well, again, not really a bit of a problem, but what you've got to look on sort of the older cars, like the 2.5s and things like this, is that the rings can get thin. Alright, the rings can get really thin through constantly hammering up and down. And again, then oil can go up to the top. One interesting point is this as well. Why is the 3 rings? Well, it's funny, in North America, this thing I learned was that the top ring's called a fire ring, because up here you've got all sorts of combustion going on and flames and things like this. So the top ring does 2 jobs. It protects this second ring, which is a compression ring. This is a compression ring too, but it's doing a lot more work, and probably that's why it's on a taper, so when it expands and contracts it's getting tighter into that bore. But this ring here in principle does most of the work. This memory card's getting worse. I just wanted to tell you about the positioning of piston rings when you're fitting them. There is sometimes a mark on the top of the ring that is said top, strangely enough. It is most important why they are marked top, because the profile can be like this. Alright, it's like a scraper ring. Now, if my mate Bob's watching this, he'll remember many years ago when his dad built an engine up, he'd actually put 2 pistons in with the rings in upside down. So what had happened was, on your crankshaft, so that would be your pistons, you had 2 rings like this, like so. This would be 1, and then on number 3 he had the rings upside down. Oh, wait a minute, 1, 2, 3 and 4. So there was a lot of resistance when you were trying to turn the engine over. Yeah, that's right. Yeah, that's right. Yes, that's right. Yeah, you had to think about that for a minute. So as these were coming down, as these were going up, these were coming down. So you had friction here, and you had friction here. I was going a bit there. It's like a 6 o'clock in the morning video. Give me a break. So as these were going up and this was coming down, you had a lot of friction on these points, and it wouldn't allow it to turn. If, however, the piston rings were like this, when these were going down, there's less resistance because of the taper, because of the angle. Anyway, all we did was take the pistons out, swap the rings around, put them back in, hey presto, away it went. So there's one thing to watch for. If it's got top on it, put the ring to the top. If it hasn't got any marks on, well, you can put it anywhere you want. Just a couple of things to notice. I'll also add on here just a little note about modern type of pistons. Excuse my drawings, I'm not Rolf Harris, but there again, I'm not in prison, am I? Now, a little bit of a story about pistons. In the good old days, pistons used to be very long, and so long they used to put an oil control ring right down at the bottom. because they were very slow up and down the cylinders. These were fitted to long stroke engines, quite torquey, but no sort of power, if you see what I mean. Modern day cars, lots of horsepower, but no torque. Well, not much torque anyway. So there used to be a lot of friction on the sides of the pistons as it was twisting, because obviously when you're putting power coming down and you're trying to push this piston around the crank, the pistons turn in the cylinders. And this is why I said to you that the cylinder bores can go like a pear shape, because it's that action of coming back up and down. They're actually sort of almost going in a figure of 8 when you think about it. So they do wear out the cylinders, but these old engines used to plod along quite nicely, a lot of torque, but a big heavy piston. Now if we fast forward to modern day engines, what they've done now is they've made them like really small, and they put the rings in at the top, but they've reduced the friction on the side of the piston to almost next to nothing. This means that these can be put in short stroke engines, which are very peppy, very sporty, if you see what I mean. But there is a downside for that, because they can actually break and start to tip and break off. And I think Subarus are particularly prone to this. Somebody might correct me on this, but there's a guy in town who replaces a Subaru engine every week because of the pistons tip over. And lots of modern engines are like this. I actually heard one tapping away, and I couldn't realise what the hell it was. And it was a piston banging up and down in the cylinder. And it was a sort of a big job to replace. It wasn't like just take the head off in the oil pan and put another piston in. It was completely strip the engine down to get at it. So things have gone a lot more modern. You know, you've got a very light piston flying up and down, and that makes your engine a lot more efficient. But again, it doesn't mean it's going to last all that long. These good old pistons here would go on for donkey's years. So that's another little bit that I've stuck into this video. So let's get back onto what I was rambling on about. If we want to test the bore and we haven't got any fantastic tools and equipment, we can simply push the ring in, and then using the piston, we can just tap it down a little bit with the piston, and that piston now is nice and square with the bore. Now I don't know if you can see here, probably you can, there is a little gap. Now in the book it tells you what that gap should be, and you can understand now what I was saying, that when the engine heats up, that gap gets very small. Now if these are all sort of predetermined gaps now, you don't have to file them like I was saying before. But if those rings were touching and then it was hot, you'd get a lot of problems. It would be very tight in the bore, and that would promote rapid wear of the cylinder. So everything's a sort of a science with these things. So if you want to check the bore, here's a really easy way to do it with a ring. You put your feeler gauges in that gap and measure the top, and then push it down, measure the gap down at the bottom or in the middle, and then right down at the bottom, but not right at the very bottom, because when you've got your piston, it never comes out at the bottom of the bore completely. Sometimes it comes out a little bit, but not that much. So about, well, I don't know, about 2 centimetres off the bottom, measure it again and compare them, and they should be exactly the same if the bore's parallel. So that's a quick and easy way to check the bores. It's not guaranteed to be perfect, but as I was saying before, sometimes these bores, because of the thrust on the camshaft side, will make the cylinder almost like pear-shaped, because the piston here is rocking backwards and forwards. So when it goes down the cylinder, it's trying to push against the thrust side. So as the crank's going round this way, the piston's trying to push this way to push down. It's kind of a science, but it's very important. Ah, dear me. I think it's the memory card that's wrong with this camera. So what I was going to say was, I've taken rings out of engines in the past where, even though the rings have been spaced around properly, after a few years the rings will move round the bore. Now I didn't know if it was an urban myth or something like that, but it does actually happen. The rings can move in the grooves. Just be aware of that. It doesn't give you an excuse to not to fit them properly in the first place, but it's something to know. So next thing, what we're going to have a look at again is some other bits and pieces on this block.